Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China from my studio at home. I just watched an incredible admission from Vance, the US Vice President, on a post on X, Twitter, by Corrine, also known as Oopsguess. And before we start, I think we should all watch a little bit of it. So I'm going to show some short clips from it as I go through the underlying meaning of this. We can be in no doubt at all that we're in the midst of a realignment of global economic power. The G7 is no longer anywhere near the top 7 economies in the world. China, India, and Russia would be in it if it were. But what was most extraordinary about Vance's speech was that he just came right out and said the quiet parts out loud. So while he was clearly speaking about the US, he vicariously means the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Portugal, and Spain, which were, until the Second World War anyway, the global rich. They allowed poor countries into the economic chain so that they could create the goods that the richer economies could use. That's globalization, he said. Have a look at this.
The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things.
His words, the idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poorer countries made the simpler things, are a very clear admission of something that is very, very wrong. It might be okay for people to think this, but obviously those that do can only be termed racists. Why should the so-called rich countries have all the benefit? If we were to examine these rich countries that he speaks of, what do we notice? They're all white countries. The obvious first poor country to break the mold was Japan. It industrialized with US help. It went to war with US help. Then it was destroyed by US atomic bombs so that after the war, it became the cheap manufacturing center for much of the global North's progress, and it was under US control and economic management until it became too big and actually reached the number 2 economy in the world when it needed to be pulled back into line and was economically destroyed by the Plaza Accord. US manufacturing just moved a short sea crossing into Taiwan. British manufacturing was already in Hong Kong. India had gained independence, and what happened to them, we don't know. It's still mired in poverty to this day. Bangladesh can do what India used to do, so can Pakistan, and they remain in poverty too. Hong Kong was doing great, and China asked for it back. Thatcher gave it back. So its manufacturing moved into the mainland. And as Vance pointed out, a combination of US designs, Taiwan know-how, and Chinese cheap labor at that time meant he could open his iPhone box and pull out an American-designed product which carries an enormous profit margin made by a Taiwanese company which itself made a healthy profit from a product assembled in China using cheap labor.
You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else.
China was wise to this. It didn't want to remain a force of cheap labor, so instead of allowing a few fat cats to get rich, it took the small amounts of money it was making and invested. It invested in education. It invested in cleaner production methods. It invested in communications, and it invested in infrastructure. Now China has very little in the form of cheap labor. It has innovative products. It has incredibly complex supply chains. It also has the ability to ship products faster than any other country so that Americans can continue to have reasonably priced goods. But in the mind of J.D. Vance, this means, and I quote, a failure of the logic of globalization.
Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends.
The US had no intention of reducing global inequalities. It's clearly admitted here. Their intention was to ensure global inequalities remain in place and rich countries are able to benefit from exploiting poorer countries. When he talks about
and whether we were offshoring factories to cheap labor economies or importing cheap labor through our immigration system, cheap labor became the drug of Western economies. And I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct.
Importing cheap labor, he forgets to mention one very important point. It started with slavery. A resource that Africa had in abundance was people. Those people were cheap labor. It went on to minerals and oils. Poor countries had them, so cheap labor was used to bring them out of the ground to profit richer countries that controlled the poorer countries, usually with military support. Countries in Africa like Cameroon, Congo, Burkina Faso, Niger, these are not poor countries, but they're full of poor people. And that, according to Vance in this speech, is what needs to continue. USA's foreign policy might have been slightly less colonial than, say, Great Britain's was. For example, for the most part, they didn't enter countries with a new government to impose over the locals as the British did. But like the British did with their armies, the US have done exactly this with theirs. Vance is admitting here there's no such thing as a free market. His country is proving that it's not just Vance speaking, it's the government policy. And we know this because there is now a list of countries that the US trade with that's been assigned numbers. This number-based system is based on how high their deficit or surplus is. This is in complete and total contradiction of World Trade Organization rules. But hey, the US can do whatever they want, can't they? Tariffs on Canada and Mexico are in complete contravention of the agreement that Trump created to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, but he's put them on anyway. Tariffs on Australia, a country that's hardly even trading with the US, but helps them enormously with a military presence in places like Darwin, where there are 2,500 Marines on permanent rotation, and Pine Gap, the most important military establishment that the United States has outside of mainland America. These all mean nothing. Australia got tariffed anyway. It doesn't matter if it's Taiwan Semiconductors anymore. They need to move to the USA in order to remain viable under this administration. And the island of Taiwan has no more degree of importance to the USA other than an unsinkable launching pad off the coast of China. Trump's trade policies, echoed here by Vance, aren't about national security at all. They're about a vain and probably, if we're honest, too late effort to preserve the global economic order that the US wants to retain so their elites can sell cheap products with massive margins, so their consumers can get ripped off. Their military is retained as a need for a strong and enduring presence, and where poorer nations really ought to know where they belong. That's Vance's order. If anyone really believed that China was a threat to the USA, that Huawei was a national security threat, that the cotton, the polysilicon, and the solar panels coming from Xinjiang were ever from forced labor, or that China's EV manufacturing, its robotics, its automation, or anything else, anywhere where China now leads the world with stolen IP, they now know the real reason for all these baseless allegations. They were all created, designed, and alleged so China would know its place in the pecking order and should step back to remain a good, cheap manufacturing partner and not speak out of turn. If we're going to consider America's innovation, it has been great. They gave us smartphones. They started the electric car industry. They knew the benefits of solar power and were implementing these years ago. These things were great, but the only innovation they now seem to have is the manufacturing of lies to smear the country that's taken all these great ideas and made them better, made them cheaper, and more freely available to the people who needed them the most, the global South. The place where Vance's cheap labor comes from, or where his corporate elites go in search of higher profits and lower costs. The China threat, the only real threat that China poses, is very real. It's overtaken the US in almost every respect. It's trading with more countries. It's doing more global south to global south trade. It's causing something the president, the vice president, and the people of America are very reluctant to acknowledge. It's a country which ought to be in the slow lane, but it's passing them in the fast lane. Now, as those smaller countries become richer, so do their people. As their people become richer, the source of America's cheap labor dries up. Is this how a free market economy should work? It seems that's only acceptable to Vance and Trump when the free market has a leader. I sincerely hope that all the leaders of all the developing nations see and understand this video of Vance's speech. Their future depends on it. I suspect this will be compulsory viewing at BRICS, and at the end result, it might be a spectacular own goal by Vance, because the only way to avoid exploitation by the US is not to do business with the US on their terms. And if that means not doing business with them, then that might not be a bad thing, especially for developing nations who the US has just admitted it wishes it could continue exploiting, and will continue to exploit if it gets the chance. Thanks once again for watching my take on China. Don't forget, like, share, and check your subscribe button. I will see you next time. Bye for now.